listening to the Hey Legal podcast.
CPD, when you want, where you want.
CPD for modern lawyers.
This free Hey Legal podcast is brought to you with the support of Caseload from De Novo Business Intelligence.
Hi and welcome back to the Hey Legal podcast. We have a really interesting show coming up this week as Ally Thomson is in discussion with Paul Seils, the director at the European Institute of Peace in Brussels. Paul has had a very interesting career thus far. He is a lawyer by profession, but for more than 20 years he has worked in conflict and post-conflict situations around the world, working with victims, governments and international organisations. Throughout the show we find out what made Paul want to study law.
Firemen or footballers or novelists or whatever you were thinking you were going to be. That's what I thought I was going to be. So I didn't intend to study law at all. As you probably know, I was going to be a priest.
We then find out about Paul's internship at the United Nations.
The honest truth is that a guy I'd done the Masters with phoned me up and he said, "We need more people on this team, can you come?" Nowadays, to do that, it's a much more competitive process.
We also hear about Paul's 5 years in Guatemala, leading an investigation into the state's genocide of Mayan groups in the 1980s.
Time to up sticks and I went off to Guatemala for 5 years, which was the obvious choice when you think about it. And that was a matter of basically helping to mobilise indigenous communities that had been massacred effectively by the Guatemalan army. That's still by far the most interesting thing I've ever done.
Subscribers to our CPD sessions will hear the full interview and further discussion on Paul's career and how he implements change and engages with different countries from his headquarters in Brussels. Also, a reflection on his chosen career path to date and his role as serving as a professor at St Andrews University. A lot coming up, so let's begin.
So Paul, thanks very much for joining me today. At Hey Legal, we're very interested in careers that have taken interesting paths, and I think I'd like to start by asking you what it was that made you want to study law in the first place.
What's a quick answer to that? I didn't intend to study law at all. As you probably know, I was going to be a priest.
I do know that.
So all the time you guys were thinking about being firemen or footballers or novelists or whatever you were thinking you were going to be, that's what I thought I was going to be. So I didn't even think about anything like that until I was about 20 when I decided not to do that. And then I went to Glasgow Uni and I'd done a philosophy degree in Rome, which didn't really prime me for the world in any practical sense, obviously. And then did an MA in Italian and Spanish at Glasgow, and still was thinking, I'm not really sure what happens at the end of this. Mm-hmm. And it was halfway through that. At that time, I think you can still probably do the kind of MA LLB kind of conversion thing or whatever. And that was it. I didn't have any great vision, which isn't a very inspirational start, is it? No, I was really wondering what the hell I would do because I hadn't thought about it. Because, as I say, for most of my kind of adolescence, I thought I knew what I was going to do. So I had to work it out kind of later on. And I mean, the path I took afterwards probably made some sense in relation to that. But at the time, it was really, in all honesty, saying, I wonder how I'm going to make a living.
And you started to make that living then after the diploma in a high street law environment?
I did in the glorious company of Carr and Company. I was in Muirhead and Baillieston mainly, doing my traineeship there, which was great fun and good people. Yeah, all criminal, bar a bit of employment really, and an 8-month corruption trial where I learned an awful lot.
Okay. And did you stay on after your traineeship, or had your thinking matured and you were thinking to move on elsewhere?
No, I had kind of half decided in the middle of the second year that I would probably not want to stay on longer term. I enjoyed it. Well, to be honest, it was exciting. It was a good laugh as well, and the company was always very good. But the cases, even at an early stage, were interesting, and I'd been lucky to do some small cases that I found interesting. But I had decided halfway through that I fancied to go and do a master's down in London. So I went down to UCL in London and did a master's in public international law, which was partly human rights, partly international economic law and immigration and refugee law.
Right, was that 1 year course?
1 year down there, yeah, 12 months, full year.
Right. So what happens after that?
After that, again, you're looking for jobs. Usual story. There was a couple of options. I did a small thing at the UN, basically an internship for a few months. It was, again, a bit of an eye-opener, not always necessarily in a good sense. It's like everything else when you see the kind of sausage-making process. It's not as what you necessarily thought of it from the outside, but it was very interesting. I was doing some stuff on Kosovo and former Yugoslavia at the time, just for a few months. But then I got a job working back here in Edinburgh at the Scottish Refugee Council, and I became the legal director of that relatively quickly, which was brilliant. I really enjoyed that. I did that for about 2.5 years, and that was just full on doing asylum appeals for people that had been refused, and it was very good. We had at the risk of being immodest, we held the best record of successful appeals for those 2 years but the bottom line was we were fully concentrated in that. We could spend like 12 hours with one client, whereas most kind of private solicitors would be spending much less.
So I just take you back when you talked about the internship at the UN. So how does one go about accessing and achieving that?
Well, I mean, it's different now. Unfortunately, that's almost 30 years ago, isn't it? Or 25 anyway. At that time, I mean, the honest truth to that story is that a guy I'd done the Masters with had gone over, and he'd been much more assiduous and knowledgeable about this. He was a friend from Canada. He's now back in Canada as a judge, but he had done all of his homework and got in very knowingly when he was doing the Masters in London with me, and he had a plan to get to know all of the professors and get research programs with them and internships, and I literally had no idea that there was a whole angle to be worked. And so, to be frank, I kind of benefited from his knowledge on that, and he had ended up out there, and he phoned me up and he said, "We need more people in this team, can you come?" And that was that. And that was actually very good. It was, but nowadays to do that, it's a much more rigorous and kind of official process. I mean, there's still a lot of kind of, they've tried to make it less of a, I don't know if that was a back scratching exercise that I benefited from. In a sense it was, although he wasn't exactly a player in that sense. But I think nowadays there's more discipline and rigour. People have to apply for those things. It's a very competitive process now. But I mean, basically it's applications nowadays and fairly rigorous competition.
So you were at the Scottish Refugee Council and then decided that it was time again for a fresh challenge?
Time to up sticks, and I went off to Guatemala for 5 years, which was the obvious choice when you think about it. I mean, it was in a sense a relatively logical choice, although not obvious to anyone that wasn't close at the time. But I mean, I had for years been interested in Latin American kind of politics and all of the stuff that went on. If I was very interested, I was, in all honesty, also say watching the film Salvador in 84 or 85 or something. Is that when that came out? Maybe 86. And a friend of mine had already gone out there, and basically again it was a situation of she was going to leave. Did I want to take over some of what she was doing? And that was that. Went out there.
So who were you working for there?
So that's an interesting story itself. So out of the Civil War, in Guatemala started, people would debate it, sometime in the first half of the 1960s, between 62 and 64. And through that, obviously, various guerrilla movements developed and everything else. And then as the peace process came to a conclusion, some of those movements began to develop their own kind of civil society or legal practices and things like that. So one of them was a thing called Centre for Legal Action and Human Rights. So that was exactly an attempt to make sure that human rights were vindicated through the courts and all of that, rather than through conflict, etc. And that was who I worked for. So I became the legal director there after a year or so. But the main part of the work was really from about halfway through the first year till the end of my time there. We worked on basically designing and carrying out investigations into the genocide that had occurred during the war, basically in one period in 81 to 82, arguably into 83. And basically that's still by far the most interesting thing I've ever done. both, socially, politically and legally, all of those things were coming together at the same time. And that was a matter of basically helping to mobilise communities. These were all indigenous communities that had been massacred effectively by the Guatemalan army through that period, and really helping to organise them, in a sense, educate them about the legal system as well, and to persuade them that there was possibly a value in putting any kind of trust in that, which is a hard thing to do when the only connection you've had with the state at all has been for them to come and massacre you. So it's a hard sell, and most of the communities didn't. We probably worked with about 70 villages over that period, and at the end of the day about 25 came in a kind of what you might call a class action, but it was a criminal case with 12 villages involved in each one, more or less. And that was that. So we worked at that, and I left there in about 2001, and those guys continued with the cases, and eventually they prosecuted the former president in 2013. He was convicted for genocide. That's how long it takes. And then a suitcase full of money was taken to the Supreme Court, and it was quashed, right. Which is also how it happens. Okay. And they retried it recently, and unfortunately the former president died in between times. He was well into his 80s. But the court still upheld and said we recognise that the army was responsible for genocides. And when we started that back in 1999, most people thought we were insane to think that you should even think about bringing a genocide case against the army in Guatemala at that time. And our argument was, well, you tell us we're in a democracy governed by the rule of law, and everything else is, the peace is here and everything else. And I said, well, if that's the case, then there shouldn't be a problem. And if it is a problem, it's time we knew about it, and we should, shine a light on that being a problem. That took 5 years out of my life anyway.
What was the evidence gathering process for that? How did you go about that?
Well, basically like any kind of system crime or organised crime, so you're doing your crime-based evidence, which is obviously taken as far as possible from any surviving eyewitnesses, which would often be very few by the time you got to that, because a lot of people would have been killed, or they would have been very young at the age at the time the crimes were committed. But a lot of forensic evidence, exhumation of graves. I've been at more exhumations than I can care to remember. And that obviously is, quite compelling evidence in terms of the way in which executions were carried out, and the kind of way, you would still be able to get, arms behind people's backs with the kind of ropes around their hands and all of that kind of evidence that was very graphic and telling. And then the kind of injuries on the heads and bullet wounds and all of that, you could tell if they're executed or in crossfire or whatever else. And then basically building up the evidence through basically inside sources in the military that were prepared to give things like, so basically military orders are divided quite often into general and daily orders. And we managed to get a hold of all of the Army's general and daily orders from 78 to 83 through a source, which gave away an awful lot of information about command and control issues. And then as the years went on, more stuff leaked and more stuff came out, and that could be authenticated. So it wasn't that hard. The truth is, in a country like Guatemala, though, you're at a certain point, there's a tipping point, because the supposition or the presumption on the part of people to do these things is one of institutional impunity. They just don't think that it's ever going to happen. So they increasingly take less care even at the time of the crimes, they take very little care to protect themselves. It's not like, a sophisticated mafia organisation that's built to obscure evidence all the time. Yeah. So once the politics moves and the institutional politics moves, you've got a much better chance, and sometimes that's just a matter of time, but also getting your ducks in a row.
Right.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Thank you for listening to this Hey Legal podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. To hear the full CPD qualifying content, please visit heylegal.co.uk to subscribe and join our community. Or you could ask your law firm to contact us for a firm-wide subscription. Learn more, be more with Hey Legal.